This is Jim Fetzer with James Fetzer News, once again with my very special guest, Judyth Vary Baker, who knew Lee Oswald in New Orleans and who has met one of the most knowledgeable experts on the assassination of JFK, namely Gerald Patrick Hemming, who is esteemed by James Richards, one of the leading experts on the individuals involved in the assassination, and also by Noel Twyman, the author of Bloody Treason, who devotes the longest chapter of his book to Hemming. Judyth, tell us about your connection to Hemming.
Well, Lee and I were in New Orleans walking along. We were going toward Bannister's office, I can't remember. Anyway, I think we were going toward Bannister's office, and ahead of us, turning around the block and coming ahead of us, was a very tall fellow. I mean, really tall. And I commented to Lee on it, and he said, "You know who that is?" I said, "No." He said, "That's Jerry Patrick." Now, Jerry Patrick was Jerry Patrick Hemming. He added Hemming later, okay? So Lee said Jerry Patrick. And he said he was in Alpha 66, and he has his own group called Interpen. And he said they have a presence in Covington. And that he had known him out at No Name Key, knew about him at No Name Key, and that he had met him on Cedar Key. And he said that sometime he might be important to me. This was just before the raid. Sometime before the raid that was made on Lake Pontchartrain near that shore. People were getting ready for the raid. That raid was really a staged event in a way. It seems everybody knew it was going to be coming. At least the people I knew it was going to be coming. And Lee had been out there, but he had to make himself scarce because if he had actually been present at the raid, that would uncover him either as maybe someone who told everybody where it was located, or maybe that they didn't. They may have thought he infiltrated when at that particular time, he was making a training film and he was part of the anti-Castro movement. This is before he became active, passing out pamphlets and so on, So this is the first part of his life, just like when he was helping guide Bannister just before that, going on college campuses, which Dr. Michael Kurtz, who was a historian at one of the great Louisiana universities, saw him himself, working with Bannister seeing that when they went to college campuses and everything. Here's Lee with him because Bannister stood out like a sore thumb. None of these college kids would have talked to Bannister, but with Lee present, it looked like he had a college student with him. Then they were able to present arguments, and their arguments were pro-segregation, and it was a really rough time at that time in New Orleans. And by arguing pro-segregation, some of the students would come and say, "No, we're against that. We're anti-segregation. We're anti-segregation, and we want to see integration. We want to see blacks on campus and all that. And we're going to fight for it." Well, you know what? It was really hard on Lee because that's the way he believed too. He believed in human rights, and he believed that the Negro should have his right. We called them Negroes back then, and should have the right to attend college or whatever they wanted. Yet he had to help Bannister at this time to collect the names of those people who stood out and said that they were they were against segregation and they were for human rights, because they believed they would be out there soon as college got let out. They were going to be out there and be activists in marches to Washington and everything else. And some of those poor kids actually got expelled from college because Bannister got their names. And Lee wasn't the only one who worked with Bannister on that. We now have found accounts of others other young men like Lee that were used with Bannister in these various expeditions. So anyway, Lee's doing a lot of different things. And he tells me about Hemming, and I said, "Well, what has Hemming got to do with all this?" Actually Patrick is what he called him. And he said, "Well, you never know." He said, "Patrick has to be many faces to many different people." So I'm going to tell you about him, though, because the time may come when you may need the information. I ought to add also that you'll see in my book, me and Lee, how it was that Lee actually trusted me and did give me information. I had to go through a lot, really, to get him to trust me, and it's in the book. be that as it may, he said, there's things I want to tell you about Hemming, or actually Patrick. And with these keys, he will trust you. And this is why he trusted me many years later when I told him these three things. One, he said, tell him about El Monte, California, that you know about his family. I didn't know anything about his family, but I told Hemming that years later when I first talked to him on the phone. And the second thing he told me to say is, remind him about the man's name was Carl Smith. Now, actually, this was Carl Faber Smith, and he was an engineer who worked with Hemming on a project where they were testing they were doing a test on how much heat a human body could take, and it was something nobody knows about Gerald Patrick Hemming except, I suppose, me and Carl Faber Smith, who's now dead. But my family knows I had a lot to do with Carl when I met him, and we got to be friends in Florida for several years. And it was because he knew Hemming and because he trusted me too. And that was part of his past he didn't want anybody to know about. And I have a lot more to say about him. But at any rate, when I told Gerald Patrick Hemming about Carl Smith and then I had a third thing to tell him, and that was that Lee told me that he knew Apache. He knew how to speak Apache. So after that, Jerry, he knew I had talked to Lee Oswald. So I think that was pretty important about that. And Jerry was so kind as to, he gave me his entire email list, which I can send to you if you want to look at it. Shows everybody on it. But he also blind copied me when he wrote to his Interpen members. I did save one of those, printed it out, so that people could see that he did trust me. To the outside world, Jerry would sometimes say ridiculous things or whatever, because if he didn't trust or respect the researcher, he'd send him on a wild goose chase. He was a very wise man. He managed to keep his life, Even so, he ended up incarcerated for a period of time, and he was kind of bitter about that. When he got out, he found out everything was stolen, even his jacket that had all these things on it that were so important to him, the different patches of what he'd done, in his career. And the Interpen members all got together and made him another jacket. And Jerry took that jacket out and showed it to me, and I took pictures of it, and I have pictures of that. At that time, Jerry was still walking, but he would soon be bent over. He was about 6'6", okay? I guessed he was 6'7". And Lee said, well, that's close enough. And so I even wrote a book that was about the exploits of someone that I thought would be like Gerald Patrick, and I called it the book 6'7", and I wrote that book in 1965. And that's on record because I had a literary agent at that time.
Judyth, tell me a little more about Interpen.
Well, Interpen basically, they were a bunch of soldiers of fortune used by the CIA, and they did everything from gun running to harassing Cuba, Castro, renting boats and going over and blowing up things. Jerry was doing that stuff. Jerry has killed people. In fact, I said, Lee, I had already heard from David Ferry. David Ferry called him a monster, I said, I heard he was a murderous monster, He said, no, he's not crazy either, but he's crazy like a fox, that's what Lee told me. So they knew each other. Now, Hemming, when he's talking to A.J. Weberman is an investigator. He also founded the garbology concept that's used by anthropologists. And he was following Dylan around, Bob Dylan. So that's the kind of thing that was going on. And Jerry Hemming's Interpen is famous. The people are still associated with each other. And to this day, I respect every single member of them very much. I miss Jerry, and I'm sorry he's dead.
I'll see if I can't get you a copy of Noel Twyman's book, Bloody Treason, Judyth. It's coming out in a new edition, and you can read the chapter about Hemming, and perhaps we can have a second conversation about him based on your experience, but I also think you might be interested in, possibly correcting what Noel had to say.
Yeah, well, as I say, some of the things that Jerry said to the outside world were basically to save his life. And for example, he minimized the contact he had with Lee, and he even minimized Lee's association with the assassination and so on. He himself was asked to kill Kennedy, and I'm sure that he was telling me the truth when he told me that.
Judyth, I look forward to our next conversation. This is Jim Fetzer of James Fetzer News, concluding my most recent conversation with Judyth Vary Baker. Judyth, thank you so much.
You're welcome. Bye-bye.
Bye.